All right, Shalom. First and foremost, I want to start off by giving all praises and glory and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem, Harakah Kodash, and double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone who well. Peace and blessings and salutations to the hopeful elect, the Bayath, Dawadah, the house of David. All right, we just going to jump right into it. All right. So this is the Insurrection Act of 1807. Is a United States federal law that empowers the president to deploy the U.S. military and federalize the National Guard to suppress domestic insurrections and rebellion and civil disorder. Through the act was formalized in 1807, its history traces back to earlier statutes and events that highlighted the need of federal authority to respond to initial threats or initial threats, right? Origins of the Insurrection Act. It says the Militia Acts of 1792, following the devastating loss by the U.S. forces that the Northern West Indian Wars, Congress passed legislation granting the president authority to call up state militias under certain conditions. This was the first attempt to define presidential power in response to domestic threats. It says Blur Conspiracy, 1806. It says after the political career was ruined, former Vice President Aaron Burr, it says, was accused of conspiring to seize territory in the American Southwest from Mexico. In response, President Thomas Jefferson sought congressional authority to deploy troops to stop the rebellion. It says this resulted in the passage of the Insurrection Act of March 1807, which made the president's power to use federal forces to quell insurrection permanent. All right, key amendments. It says throughout its history, the Insurrection Act has been amended and reflect the nation's changing and needs to grant the president's broader authority. Reconstruction era. It says 1871, following the Civil War. It says the Third Enforcement Act was passed to combat the Ku Klux Klan. This amendment gave the president the power to innovate military to protect the constitutional rights of citizens, even without a state's request for help. I'm just reading this off verbatim, right? So it says passed 9/11/2006. It says an amendment passed in 2006 to broaden the act to cover national disasters and other major public emergencies. This expansion, all right, of the presidential power was largely repealed in the 2008 following objections from the state governors. It says notable use throughout U.S. history. It says the Insurrection Act has been invoked by numerous presidents for a wide range of situations, from labor disputes to enforcing civil rights. It says antebellum period. It says President Andrew Jackson used the act in 1831 to suppress Nat Turner's slavery rebellion in Virginia. Goes to show you what is this about. This act was put in there for really Jake, man. All right, now you'll see later on. So a lot of it was really put in, and then going into, as you can see, it said about the Indians, the so-called Indians, but you know that they are brothers. Is the northern tribe. All right, as you can see, it says the Northwest Indians. They're not Indians; they're Israelites. All right, okay. That's where you get the trial of tears. All right. Okay. So let's continue on. Where we at with it? It says the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln relied on the act in 1861 at the start of the Civil War to mobilize federal troops. It says Reconstruction President Ulysses S. Grant used the act in the early 1870s to combat Ku Klux Klan violence and enforce federal law in the South. It says Civil Rights Movement President Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, it says, deployed federal troops to enforce school desegregation in Arkansas in 1957 and Mississippi 1962. It says, respectively, the President Lyndon B. Johnson also used it to protect civil rights activists during the Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965 and to respond to the riots in Detroit in 1967 and Washington, D.C. in 1968. It says, recent history, the most recent invocation was by President George H.W. Bush in 1992 during the Los Angeles riots following the Rodney King verdict. It says modern context, the Insurrection Act remains controversial due to the broad and vaguely defined powers it grants the president. It says critics, including the Barron Center for Justice, all right, the Varian Center for Justice argued that the act is urgent need to reform to include clear limitations and greater checks on presidential authority. All right, so let's go here. Let's go to the all. All right, let's get off the history. We gave you the history. All right, so let's do this. Okay, so it says, Trump says he is considered invoking the Insurrection Act, and what does that mean? It says President Donald Trump says he's considered declaring the insurrection inside the United States, accusing domestic governors, Democratic governor, and mayors for preventing the federal government from enforcing immigration laws and this is all coming up against Jake. This is when you know this is Jacob's trouble, man. We in the midst of Jacob's trouble. ICE is a part of Jacob's trouble for the Northern Kingdom, man. It's all gonna come down to the southern. It's all gonna come to the Southern Kingdom too. They out in Chicago, man. They're gonna go to all the major cities where Jake is at. This is where Nero 47 comes in. This is him. This is his spirit coming up against Jake because he has hatred for the Israelites, man. All right? Nero 47 got hatred for the Israelites. This is all prophecy being done all over again. All right? Prophecy this is the same thing happening again. All right? It says preventing the federal government from enforcing immigration laws and turning the cities into war zones. Chicago's great city where there's a lot of crime, Trump told reporters on Tuesday, and if the governor can't do the job, we will do the job. It's all very simple. It says invoking the Insurrection Act with unfurlingly extraordinarily presidential power to the use of military force in American cities and in a manner not used since the Civil Rights Movement. It says it also would potentially pit troops from a Southern Republic-run state against the Northern Democratic-run cities and states. It says some 200 National Guard troops from Texas were preparing to deploy to Chicago this week, administration officials told a federal judge this week, who agreed not to block the deployments for now. It says that escalates the situation quite a bit. All right, Catherine Kosmosky, or however you say her name, director of studies at the Center for the New American Security, said that the deployment of Texas troops to Chicago, it creates a tinderbox, she said. Under the law, the president can use military troops to protect federal buildings and federal employees, but they can only conduct domestic law enforcement if they remain under the control of the state's governors. It says a major expectation to those constraints is the Insurrection Act. It says, which Trump said he'd be open to invoking if people were getting killed and the Democrats running states like Illinois and Oregon were holding us up. Signed into law in 1807 by President Thomas Jefferson, the law allows the president to deploy military troops inside the United States to act in a law enforcement and a quell of insurrection that threatens a state or its residents. It says if it had to enact it, I do to Trump. It says I do, Trump said. It says if people were being killed and courts were holding us up and governors or mayors were holding us up, sure, I do that. It says in an interview in a Newsmax, Trump said that he wouldn't invoke the law if he didn't have to. It says at the same time he told the outlet what is happening is pure insurrection. All right. As you can see, this is some more of this article. Let me see. I wanted to see how much more. Okay, this is how much more is left. It says Illinois Democratic Governor J.B. Pence, was it Pritzker? Pritzker. It says Pritzker. It says has called allegations of civil unrest in the state and complete BS and pushed back the arrival of the Texan troops as an unconstitutional invasion of Illinois by the federal government. It says if Trump declares an insurrection in Illinois, it would mark the first time that a president have invoked the law without a governor's consent since Lyndon Johnson did so to protect civil rights activists in 1965 in Alabama. It says since then the law has been invoked at the governor's behest. It says including in 1992 during the riots in California following the acquittal of police officers accused of beating motorist Rodney King. It says on Monday, both Texas GOP Governor George Abbott, all right, and senior Trump aide Stephen Miller, it says echoed Trump's accusations that Chicago was a war zone and blamed the Democratic politicians as refusing to enforce federal laws. It says we have local. This right here, he's coming up against Jake. He want Jake. He wants you Israelites, man. Okay? He wants you buy-ins and all you. He want all of you. Okay? You Southern Kingdom, man. All right? Nero 47 want the Southern Kingdom. That's what he want. This is Jacob's trouble. All right? You see, we in the midst of Jacob's trouble, man. It says we have, where is it? It says we have a local states refusing to enforce the law, and we have chaos. It says Abbott says in an interview on Fox News with host Sean Hannity. It says Miller, who has led Trump's push for the mass deportation inside the United States, directly accused local officials of trying to undermine the federal government. It says this is an enforcement and delegitimize the core function, all right, of the federal government in enforcing immigration laws and the sovereignty. He said in an interview on CNN on Monday. It said it is a domestic terrorism and it is insurrection. Miller added. All right. So I don't need to read the rest of that, but you got the point there. So let's get into this here. All right. Now this is the Restrict Act. All right. So check this out. It says the Restrict Act was a proposed bill that would grant the Secretary of Commerce authority to identify and mitigate risk to the U.S. national security for information and communications technology, ICT, products and services linked to foreign adversaries like China. It says, including the seniors Mark Warner and John Thorne, a bill aimed at establishing a framework and banning and restricting such technologies, including apps like TikTok, and imposing civil and criminal penalties for violations. This is going to go all the way down to YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, whatever the case, got damn social media that you have, man. Restrict Act, man. As you can see, when you pull up on that Palantir ad, it tells you about restrictions. Boom. You see? All right? And so it says, where we at? It says, while the ban aimed to address concerns about data privacy and foreign espionage, it also raised concerns about potential government overreach and restrictions on free speech and the open internet. It says key provisions of the Restrict Act. It says identifying and mitigating threats. It says the security of commerce. It says would be required to identify debtor and dispute, prevent prohibit, investigate, and mitigate transactions involving ICT product and services from countries designated or foreign adversaries. It says risk-based process. The bill proposed a risk-based approach at involving technologies and prioritizing those in critical infrastructure or with significant national security implications. Banning and penalties. It says the act would allow for the banning and restricting on foreign-owned ICT products and services deemed as a risk to national security. Violators could face significant civil and criminal penalties, including fines and imprisonment. Covered holdings. It says that Commerce Security would also have the authority to identify covered holdings, such as stocks or securities in technology companies that pose a risk or potential leading to the president's orders or divestment. All right. It says government outreach, impact on free speech. Here we go. It says there were certain that the Restrict Act could infringe upon the First Amendment rights by restricting Americans' ability to use certain online platform apps. All right. All right. Here we go. A dangerous bill. See, a dangerous bill called a Resurrect Act. All right. Gaining momentum in Congress. And as you can see here, signed in petition. And as they don't really give you much on it, but as you see, brothers, you got the gist on it right here. It says, let's read this here. It says a Resurrection Act or a Restrict Act, Salakia, was introduced in the Senate in March 2023. It says, but did not pass before the 118 Congress ended in 2024, as the bill was not ultimately passed by the House and Senate. Okay, so there's your status, but eventually they're gonna pass. The bill is already passed on the law. Esau Edom is a devil. Okay, only the devil would pass. Come on, man. The elites got they set up puppets in there, man. All right, so the bill is already passed. They got the bill ready to go. Okay, that thing is already in there, man. All right. You see? So let's go on. Let's go into the scriptures. All right, so Psalms 83, and we'll start at I'll start at verse 1. It says, keep not thy silence, O Yahweh, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O Yahweh, for lo, thy enemies make a tumult, right? Meaning an uprising. All right. It says, and they that hate thee have lifted up their head, right? They that hate thee have lifted up their head, they became proud. All right. It says, and they have taken crafty counsel, meaning real secrety. All right. Counsel, meaning they come together, have these summit meetings. All right. Against thy people. Who's thy people? Israelites, so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, that have consulted against thy hidden ones, Israelites. It says, and they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent, right? With one consent, and they are confederate, meaning they came and they made an alliance together. All right, we're going to get these Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. Yeah, okay, it says against thee. It says the tabernacles of Edom, Esau, Edom. All right, as you can see, the top chief right there. All right, and it says the Ishmaelites, okay? Moab. Moab, the Chinese, Japanese, Moab, Ammon, all right, which is the Japanese. You got the Ishmaelites, which is Ishmael, right? The Hagareans, Gabal, Gabal. It says, and Amalek, the chief grandson of Esau. All right. It says the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also is joined with them, and they have hope in the children of Lot. Salah. All right, pause right there. That's what the word salah means. All right, so let's continue on. Let's go into Micah 2 and 1. It's the book of Micah 2 and verse 1. It says, woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon it. Right, and that's the elites. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Iverheimers, the DuPonts, the Gettys. You got the they go all the way back to the Templars, the Templar Knights Templars, going back there. So, this thing is a whole high up order. You got the purple Pope, blue Pope, red Pope. You got all coming out of the Vatican. You got all these things going on, man. All right. It says when the morning is light, they practice it because the power is in their hand. Right, because the power is in their hand. All right. So they put it to use with their legislation. Right. Henceforth, let's go here to Revelation. Revelation, the 13th chapter. The 13th chapter in the 15th verse. It says,